So, all right, guys, welcome aboard. This is take two of the broadcast this week. Accidentally forgot to hit the start button as we were getting things going there. Welcome to the Sunday Mac Forum video chat. Van Smith is out and about doing God knows what this week. Um, I kind of feel sorry for his fellow Canadians. No telling what he's up to this week, so be careful, guys. We don't have a huge agenda on the show this week. Didn't have time to put together a rundown. For a while there, it looked like we weren't going to be doing an episode this week. One or two minor issues here and there, technically, but I think we got those resolved. Spent a little bit of time yesterday and today working on a Windows box that was driving me nuts. As you can tell, I'm not generally a big Windows fan. And one of the things that it kind of brought home to me in light of my experiences recently with my iTunes library basically getting basically disappearing because the NAS drive that I had it attached to, or stored on rather, went south for the winter, and that's going to be a very time-consuming process to restore. A large part of the restoration can be accomplished by going back into iTunes and re-downloading purchased content. Now, as we've discussed before with purchased content, if you've been a regular watcher of our video chats, you know, and I think I've mentioned it in a thread in the forum, that sometimes just because you have purchased something doesn't mean that it's still available when you go back to re-download that content. You may find that something that was available a few months ago, or especially over a period of a couple of years, is no longer available. Generally, that is probably the result of copyright issues, where the copyright holder decides that they no longer want it to be part of the iTunes store and did not renew the right to carry it in the iTunes store. So you can't really completely count on re-downloading to preserve your library. Make sure you have some kind of a backup strategy in place. Fortunately for me, even though it is going to be a time-consuming process to restore, I did have a partial backup. And in fact, I had a couple of partial backups that I can use to restore some of the content. And with respect to partial backups, when you are in a situation where you know that a partial backup is there, make sure that you don't delete those partial backups until you know that you don't need them, because this process would go a lot faster if I had kept my most recent backup, even if it was just a partial. I had deleted it to make some space for a new backup, and was in the process of setting things up to do the backup, you know, because it can occur in the background while I'm doing other things, or even run overnight once I set it up and start it. And before we could execute the backup process, the drive died. So you're kind of stuck there, where I had removed the backup that was closest to complete because of space considerations, in trying to make one new backup. So be aware, particularly that with media, one of the investments you're going to have to make with media is having a backup strategy, and that takes drive space. Yes, you can use cloud-based backup, but remember, when when it comes to cloud-based backups, if you don't have access to the cloud, you don't have access to your information. So while cloud-based backup is okay for some things, I wouldn't, once again, I wouldn't rely on it as the sole function, the sole backup. And I think that is true no matter what you're using. Remember that if you're using drive-based backup, say you're saving to a time capsule or something like that, don't have that be your only method, because you've reduced yourself to a single point of failure, so to speak. But you also don't want to have a cloud-based backup be your only backup, because once again you have single point of failure. If something goes wrong with restoration, the company decides to shut its doors, which I know we don't like to think about, but it does happen even in the tech world. You know, there are, if you've been following technology for the length of time that I have been following it, you'll know that there are a number of tech companies that were once reasonably well regarded, and they no longer exist. Names like Wang, for example, come to mind. And the experience I had with my first modem that I tried to purchase for an Apple II was a situation where I ordered from a third-party vendor that is no longer in business. The modem, internal modem, was about $200 at that time, and after several weeks, they were out of business, and I still didn't have a modem. So as you can see, okay, that was horrible. I think I just grabbed Diet Coke by accident. This is not good. This is not my favorite drink, by the way. But you can, as you can see, anything can go wrong. You can't plan for every single contingency, but you do need to have not only a backup plan, but that backup plan needs to look at redundancy so that you're not in a situation where you have a single point of failure. Many times, listeners, I say listeners, but forum members who post with backup plans, the plan that they have in mind is good, but somewhat incomplete in the sense that it has some flaw, generally being that there isn't redundancy. In other words, having more than one backup so that if something goes wrong, you can restore. I've had a couple of drives in the last year fail, not necessarily because they're bad drives. A couple of the drives were ones that I had had for some time, so it doesn't surprise me that they failed. In most cases, I had backups of the stuff. I had a drive be on the verge of, I had a thumb drive be on the verge of failure today because I'm in the process of moving a desktop out of the way. I accidentally didn't realize that the drive was in place, and it bent the connector, the USB 2 connector. Now, fortunately, I noticed it before it ruined the drive, and I was able to salvage what was on it. But the last time that happened, I wasn't able to salvage it. So it's you got to be careful about that. Make sure that you have some type of redundancy for your data. Also, when it comes to backing up media, keep in mind the issues revolving around what format. Format becomes important in any file in terms of having your backup in a file type that's going to be around for a while. But remember also that with media, for example, Have you saved it in a protected format that will only play back in iTunes? That's great if you know you're going to be using iTunes as your playback medium. Not so great if your device is one that does not support that proprietary, the protected format. So there's a lot of things to think about there. A lot of things that will cause you a headache. Think them through. Give it some consideration. If you have questions, ask in the forum. Our forum guys are more than willing to help. It's amazing to me the caliber of responses that we get in the forum from people, some of them who are in various aspects of the computer industry. Some of them are merely Mac fans, average people who happen to know a lot about a particular topic. So feel free to make use of that expertise. Sometimes we won't agree, but at the end of the thread, you will probably have learned something. I know I have over the several years that I've been involved with Mac Forum. Also, keep in mind as you're looking through the forum, make use of that search function. We had a discussion a couple of weeks ago about being able to search the forum using an alternate search engine instead of just using the search box that's in the forum. I know sometimes it can be a royal pain getting the right results when you're searching, but we periodically have seen a lot of comments where threads seem to be repeating themselves. For example, we've had a number of threads, various people expressing concerns about upgrading to Mavericks. And the concerns are, in many cases, identical to something that has been posted in another thread. Another one that pops up is the malware slash antivirus question. Do I need antivirus? Is it possible for Mac to get viruses? Is it possible to get malware, etc., etc., etc.? That has been an ongoing discussion for long enough now that it has its own little security area that not only deals with virus, malware type issues, but also just general questions about computer security. So be aware of that. Take a look at that. Poke around a little bit in the forum. There's all kinds of interesting data there. And it could be that in the time that it would take to post your question and get an answer, you may find an answer from someone else who has asked essentially the same question. So be aware of that. Make use of that. And I know sometimes there are going to be specifics to a situation where you need additional information. That's perfectly okay. But do be aware sometimes you can find your answer quicker by searching through threads that have already been posted. A couple of other things I wanted to mention, and I'll post the link in the discussion area and in the show thread. Someone posted, I believe it was yesterday, asking about how it is that you go about making your messages in iMessage pop up on all your devices. I'll give you a link to one way to do that. It generally involves having all the devices know about the various ways that you want to receive messages. I like having the messages pop up on all my devices so that if I've walked away from the computer room or I'm on my iPad somewhere and somebody sends me something that's kind of important, then I can answer. One of the things that I've come to pay closer attention to about technology recently is the extent to which it allows us to do things that we used to do in ways that would have been much more difficult a few years ago. For example, most of us we're fortunate enough to grow up with being around our immediate family or having an aunt or uncle uh, that we could get a hold of, or in some cases be living in the same house or nearby if we got stuck on on a homework problem. Well, now with families being scattered all over the country, that's less of an option for some families. You know, the person that you need to ask about a particular type of homework problem may be hundreds of miles away. And we, up until relatively recently, have had to resort to things like a telephone call. It's not a bad way to go at it, but some things just don't translate well. Well, my niece and I have discovered that FaceTime works reasonably well for this. I know other people have done it using Skype. The thing I like about FaceTime, it's a little easier to set up for us because we're both using Apple devices. iMessage has worked really well with them sending me a question and in some cases sending a picture of what the problem was and me being able to answer and not have to handle, you know, in the past when you had to do it by phone, the issue was always the cost of long-distance phone calls. With the advent of the internet and things like iChat and Skype and iMessage and the like, that's less of an issue, assuming that you can get the setup done in the first place, which is one of the things that I like about FaceTime. Setup is relatively easy. Even my friend Ken, whom you met on a previous podcast, on a previous video cast, he originally, being a PC user, he wanted to do everything via Skype, and he was pretty much the only reason I had Skype on my computer. Well, now that he is using Mac as his primary computer at home, using OS X as his primary computer, primary operating system, he's been using FaceTime. So consequently, I haven't opened Skype in ages, just because the few people that I video chat with, I think all of them are on FaceTime. And of course, we do use Google Hangouts for these chats. We'll be working on that during the summer. As I mentioned last week, I've got a couple of things in mind that we'll take a look at. I noticed that Dennis is still here. Hang in there, Dennis. I think it's officially fire season out in California, unfortunately. You know, we seem to hit that time of year when forest fires are a big deal. So stay safe out there, guys. Also, be aware as we go through the summer and into the fall. I'm expecting quite a few things to pop up. A lot of discussion, probably about Worldwide Developer Conference, which is coming up. I'll be curious to see what Apple will announce there. And, you know, the only thing I've noticed about WWDC is, let me put it this way, sometimes I almost feel sorry for some of the third-party vendors because Apple will make whatever announcement that they're going to make, you know, whatever it might be, and then sometimes that seems to suck almost all the energy out of the room, and for the rest of the week there's very little attention paid to some of the other announcements. I'll give you a little tip. I'm not saying to ignore the Apple announcements, but do, as you look at what comes out of Worldwide Developer Conference, take a close look at the announcements from some of these smaller companies. One, because some of them are doing some very interesting things, and two, because sometimes these smaller companies get swallowed up by larger companies, and their technology or their idea shows up later under that larger company's brand. So if you want to see where things are going, don't just pay attention to what the large providers are doing. Look at what some of the smaller development houses and smaller hardware manufacturers are doing. Some of the really interesting stuff is coming out of that. And there's always a level of involvement from companies that are doing interesting things but don't necessarily make the news because of the numbers of people that are involved. For example, there is a lot of computer equipment available, quite a bit for Windows, but there's quite a bit for Mac as well, that makes it easier for disabled users to use computers. A lot of that technology is coming out of companies that you don't necessarily hear the names of all the time unless you are familiar with them already or working with someone who needs that kind of technology. And yet the technology is interesting, and in some cases the information that develops this, comes out of this technology, pops up on a regular computer. For example, one of the things that's been in use in terms of adaptive equipment for quite some time is software that is adaptive. Word processing software that is adaptive, and what I mean by that is you start typing a word and it tries to guess what you're typing so that you don't have to finish all of those keystrokes. Well, that technology, that idea, has been around for quite a while, and it's finally made it into things like your cell phone. There are a number of other examples where something that started out as a means of helping the disabled to use a computer more effectively later becomes more widely available for just people in general, whether they have disabilities or not. So kind of pick an area. I know you can't keep track of every section of technology. There's so much out there, and it's exploding by the minute. But pick an area that's important to you. Excuse me. And let it, follow through with it. Follow the interest and see where it goes. See what's out there. It certainly makes things a lot more interesting, and it's part of the reason why you see contributions from so many different forum members. One person knows about applications in the music industry. Another person knows some little tweak that comes over from video editing, or different kinds of things like that. So make use of that. It's one way to keep things interesting. I'll certainly be keeping half an ear to the Worldwide Developer Conference announcements. There's usually something interesting coming out of that. And we'll be discussing some of that as is warranted in future segments. And finally, another kind of pseudo tip that I've mentioned before, but it seems to pop up repeatedly in ways that sometimes surprise me. One day when you've got a little bit of time with your Mac and you just want to poke around a little bit, play around with some of the keyboard shortcuts and what the Option key can do. The one that sticks in my head, because I use it all the time now, is holding down the Option key while you click on the volume icon. The volume slider in the menu bar brings up an option that lets you change the input and output settings from the sound preference pane without actually opening the preference pane. We've done that before. I mentioned that in one of the first broadcasts. But there are all kinds of others. I recently had one appear with an Option key, and I wish I could remember what it was, because I thought, boy, this is brilliant. I'll never forget it. But it's just little tweaks that you can get at sometimes by using the modifier keys, the command key, option key. Also, be aware, I know we have a little bit of a discussion going on in a couple of threads about speech recognition. You can do some interesting things with speakable items, especially in conjunction with AppleScript. I had at one time, I don't use it very much anymore, but I had at one time a script that I triggered by a voice command. And essentially what the script did was announce something that I needed to know at a certain time. So if I wanted to run the script, I would just, say the name of the script. The script would run, it would tell me a certain piece of information. And of course, with using a wireless headset, I don't even have to necessarily be looking at the screen. And there are third-party programs that add a little bit to that. I mean, Dictate, for example, has a little bit of that capability, and it will do a little bit more than speakable items. So explore all of these things. There's always going to be, new and interesting things. Something that is, and you think, I see tips now, and I think, okay, I know that. I've known that for a long time. They haven't changed it. But then I get reminded that there are always new users coming to the crowd. Even though it's not a new tip for me, it may be for them, and it may be just the thing that they're looking for. And I've also noticed that no matter how long I've been using a Mac, there's always something that I either didn't know or in some cases had forgotten, and someone reminds me. Dennis is really good about reminding me about things that I did not, I had forgotten, did not remember, or in some cases never knew. And then we have a couple of other members who seem to be really good at that. I think they must have been spying on me or something, because they'll say something and I think, oh, I knew that. Why am I not using that command? Why am I not doing this way? I don't always pick the most efficient way to solve these kinds of computers. So it's something to keep in mind as you go about learning the Mac, particularly if you're new to Mac. Don't get intimidated because you ask a question and you get 4 or 5 different ways to do something. Don't feel like there's something wrong because you don't know all these tricks. For those of us that do know them, we have been using Macs for a while. And at some point we didn't know it, and someone had to explain it to us, to teach us. And in some cases, it's not so much that you don't know it, it's just, it's an adjustment that you didn't even think of. And I'll give you an example of one that crosses platforms. If you're old enough to have been writing before word processors became the dominant means of writing, in other words, you're writing in the days of, say, the typewriter, either manual or electric. One of the things that was common practice at the time is if you made a mistake, you made a typo, you had to fix that typo right away. With the advent of the computer, though, you could, theoretically, type your entire document and then make all of your corrections and changes, either by running spell checker or by checking it manually, however you do it. You could do it that way. But yet I find that one of the hardest habits for me to break is fixing a problem right then. I'll be typing away on something, realize that I've made a mistake, and rather than keep going and not destroy the flow of what I'm writing, I'll stop right then and fix the mistake. Um, that's not, I mean, that's not a bad way to go about things, but if the mistake is strictly a spelling mistake, that's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. Probably would be more efficient to um, finish the entire document and then make all of those types of corrections in one fell swoop. But yet I can't seem to break myself of that habit. I know that some of our younger listeners probably don't have that because they've grown up with word processing and grown up with the electronic form of writing where you can make corrections quickly, easily, that kind of thing. So pick the path that gets the job done for you. That's the idea, I think. That's kind of it. That's the way to go. The thing that I think has become almost the need for a mini rant for me is, and it's not just true about the computer industry, it seems to be true all the time, or becoming more true, as I should say. It seems like we have a lot of people today, and I run into this on the internet quite a bit, who want you to do things in the way that they want it done, and if you don't do it that way, then they seem to think that it's their prerogative to say insulting things, merely because you didn't do something in the way that they would choose to do it. Now, I realize that there are sometimes specific reasons why you need to do something in a certain way. You know, these steps have to be done this way or this procedure won't work. Okay? But that's understandable. There are certain things that are always going to be true. For example, if you're about to do major alterations to your system, nothing changes the fact that a backup beforehand is a good thing. But yet you see arguments going on about why don't you use this to back up? Why don't you use that to back up? This is better, that is better. Ultimately, the goal is to get people backing up. I see this in relation to Time Machine quite a bit. There are a lot of people that don't like the fact that Time Machine backs up once an hour. They think that's too much. I understand that, and for some things I can agree with that, but that doesn't mean that backing up that frequently is a bad idea. And yet I've seen posts in other forums sometimes that give readers the impression that, oh, I've done this. I've modified Time Machine to behave this way, and if you don't do it, there's something wrong with you. Or I don't use Time Machine, I do it this way. And not only here's why, and I could live with that if you're going to say this is what I do, this is why. But then sometimes people take it one step further and treat it almost as though there's something wrong with the listener if they don't do the same things. Fortunately, most of our forum members seem to avoid that attitude. Do see a little bit of it in the forum from time to time, but it's not, fortunately, it's not become a pervasive thing. I think it's why I notice it so much when I go to other forums, look at other topics. So do keep that in mind. There usually, particularly when it comes to things that you do on the Mac, more than one way to get the job done. That's one of the things I think that has always drawn me to computers, even going as far back as the early Apple IIs. I mean, they had their limitations, but one of the things that's kind of neat about them is the modern computer, and by modern, I really am including a lot of devices in this category, and even some things like programmable calculators that some of you might not consider computers. But the modern computing, one of the things that it's allowed us to do is to have one device that in many ways is kind of like the Swiss Army knife. Excuse that reference, but you get what I mean. One device that's capable of a multitude of things, depending to some extent on what software is available. If I run iMovie, I can turn it into video editing. If I run iDVD, I can take that video that I'm edited and turn it into a DVD. But yet, a few minutes later, I can run a word processor and crank out a note to a colleague, a report. Later, I might use a spreadsheet to track expenses, finances, all from the same device. And the capability of the device is dependent on two things. One, the diversity of software that's on the machine, and two, the individual in the seat, the person running the show. And if you don't believe that's true, let me just point to you this way. Think about video editing, for example. Now, I've dabbled a little bit with Final Cut, with some of the earlier versions of Final Cut. I'm not very good at it. I generally learned video editing by the poke at it with a sharp stick method until you get an effect that you want. But you could sit an experienced video editor down with the same software, and he could produce something both much more stunning and in less time. Why? Because of the abilities that developer, that person has developed, that I don't have. Okay, so in this case, the capability of the computer is a function both of what's on the computer and who's in charge of it, who's running it. We have some members in the forum who are very good with photography. I'm not. Or you could say the same thing about music and writing and all of these different things, where the capability of the computer is dependent in part on the person sitting in the chair. That young man or young lady who is in the chair, and yes, by that I include the people in our forum who are in their 70s and 80s. I think it's great that the computer has been able to span the generations as much as it has. I would like to see more of that. And I encourage those of you who are good at it to pass on the knowledge that you have to others who have not acquired the same level of knowledge yet. Okay? Notice I'm holding open the possibility that that you will acquire. We have a number of forum members who have used computers as part of their professional life, but because of the nature of their professions for using Windows, have come to Macs as part of their retirement, and they're learning a whole different way of thinking, a whole new approach to how to get something done. That's a great thing, because it means that they can kind of compare the two and pick the tool that does the best job for what they need to do. Many times we see with switchers, which a large portion of our forum membership includes folks who either have recently switched or who are in a situation where they're what I call platform agnostic. In other words, they have to function in both Windows and Mac and Unix, and and so they kind of can pick and choose the tool that does the best job. And ultimately, I think that's the best approach to computer use. I personally prefer using a Mac, but I can use Windows. I have used it. It's not my preferred method, but I can get the job done. And I think we're all going to be reaching that point with computers, where we are not as dependent on a particular brand. More, I look at the differences in the OS between as a kind of as a difference in a way of thinking. In other words, a lot of times if you look at the difference between the way Windows approaches things, for example, and the way it's approached in OS X, completely different way of thinking sometimes. I remember one of the most frustrating things for me when I first started using Macs was the day that I realized that on a lot of Mac software, if you're about to execute an operation, this was certainly true in the System 7 days, which is when I first really began using a Mac extensively. But one of the things that was quite frustrating to me is on the Mac, quite frequently, the default, if you were going to save a file or do something that might damage or delete a file, the default setting was the option that would do no damage or do the least damage. Whereas in certain other programs on other platforms, the default settings seem to be, yes, go ahead and do this. And that's a problem if you're not reading the operations carefully. I sat down one day to do something on the Mac and tried 4 times to do something. And every time I hit the command I thought it was supposed to execute, it didn't. After doing it about 4 times, I realized the problem. I wasn't paying attention to the dialog box. The default in the dialog box was cancel, because if you executed this option, it was going to modify your data. So the developer, and I wish I could remember the name of the program, some of you probably would remember it. It was a well-known application at the time. The default option was cancel. Why? Because if you executed this, it was going to alter your data. Notice I didn't say destroy, because there are reasons why you might want to choose yes. And I hit the thing 4 times thinking I hit yes, and I hit cancel each time. Okay? I wanted to do this. It was a little frustrating to have to try to figure out why the Mac wouldn't let me do it. But it's a little bit reassuring to notice that some developer somewhere at one infinite loop decided that maybe we ought to build in a little bit of protection to keep the user from damaging their data. And at that point, I had lost data on some other systems because that was not exactly the approach that the developer had taken. So I kind of appreciated that. And you still see that a little bit, where in some software, both Mac and Windows, the option is to preserve the data and put a warning there so that you don't damage something. And yet, with other developers, that option does not seem to be quite as robust. Well, I have to say, folks, I'm going to call it an evening this evening. It's a little bit shorter than our typical forum chat. I hope that you've enjoyed this one. Van Smith tells me that he may be able to join us next week. I'm looking forward to it. I know you're probably looking forward to hearing someone other than me. Over the course of the summer, as I said last week, I hope to get a couple of other guests in. So if you have some ideas of folks that you would like to see, members that you would like to hear from, let me know in this thread, and then we'll see if we can't talk them into joining us, or make some arrangements where we can do some type of interview or something of that nature. And that's going to just about do it for the June 2nd edition of the Mac Forum Sunday video chat. Can't believe it's June already. So for those of you, I noticed that Dennis was planning to watch. Dennis, I hope you enjoyed it, and anyone else who tagged along, I hope you enjoyed it. And until next week, guys, enjoy this week in Mac computing.